We were just having that chat. Last time we talked, GPT was not a thing, and now it is.
Exactly. So, obviously, there's been a letter that's turned up, and people are talking about actually stopping developments and other things. I mean, one of the things I find interesting about this is on one hand, it's extraordinary. On the other hand, it's interesting. But the quality of resolution, and then maybe the biggest danger it brings, is the relative poor quality of everything. And actually, the automation of bad decisions and bad narratives, which are associational words but not actually symbolic constructs,
Mm-hmm.
and the distribution of that rapid mal logics, I would say bad logics into the system, is probably the biggest danger it brings. And the ability to be the bad logics to be generative, multiplying, replicable, unchallengeable, unreferenced into the system. So
Right.
like when people talk about it, I think we all often resort to the idea of the kind of the the demon AI, which is going to destroy humanity in some vicious attack of release of nuclear weapons to get rid of us. But actually, maybe it's much more insidious in the destruction of qualitative decision making, which has taken us years to construct, and the erosion of that into a fundamentally different logic structure, which is probabilistic on associative words and very powerfully associated, but it doesn't understand the symbolic construct behind those words and doesn't understand the kind of nuance of those words. So whenever, like for example, I'll give you a boring example. If you ask it, what is dark matter labs, right?
Uh-huh.
Right. So one thing I recognize as dark matter labs was web legible. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So it was able to compute it. And it was able to summarize it. And the summary was relatively okay. But it was relatively okay. But
Mm-hmm.
in nuanced terms, like it used the word consultancy, and we don't frame ourselves as a consultant. We don't see ourselves relationally as consultants. And I was like, okay, it's marginally off everywhere, marginally off
Right.
everywhere. But the marginal nature of being off everywhere is actually catastrophic in comprehension terms,
All right. So
right?
let's see. I kind of want to move back and then come back down. So let me move
Yeah,
back up for a second. All right. When I attend to this particular phenomenon, what I notice is that there's, I would say, three vectors that seem meaningful. One vector has the characteristic of being functionally competitive with existing methodologies, but either much, much faster, usually speed, much faster. So the typical example would be like writing an app, where a sort of a B plus software developer would be more than adequate. And it's really a question of just having access to being able to do it effectively, instantly, and increasingly anybody can. And say Mid-Journey 5, being able to take something and produce a graphic design or a photograph that, again, is sort of at a B plus level, but it's massified and anybody can do it. So you have two elements there. One is the disruptive piece, the people who are in fact doing B plus work, which is a lot of work. That's gone. Well, that's no longer part of the economy, which just continues to put strain on the bullshit jobs problem. And so our ability to ignore the fact of the omnipresence of bullshit jobs becomes more and more contingent. That's one vector. The second vector is the place that I'm mostly identifying what you're saying as being on. And I've run into this issue a lot as well. And interestingly enough, I notice it varying across a wide spectrum. So I asked about myself, and I noticed that because I'm also, we call it web legible, but you may recall that I have actually had two names that I've been operating under.
yeah,
ChatGPT does not know that transition is the same identity. Obviously, it doesn't know that either identity is identity, it just has probabilistic associations. But I found it quite interesting because Jordan Greenhall, according to ChatGPT, has a certain sensibility. Jordan Hall has a certain sensibility, and they're not the same, which is actually nicely accurate. And the thematic distinction was pretty good. The details were terrible, not the least of which is it identified Jordan Greenhall as being one of Jordan Hall's primary collaborators, and they had worked at a place that neither of us have ever been. Even more interestingly, I was like, all right, let me ask some other questions. So my wife, Vanessa, her previous name was Vanessa Mimas, and did a pretty good job on Vanessa Mimas. It made some errors. Again, it had a co-founder of her project. It was not a co-founder of the project. But more interestingly, it decided that she was dead. It had her dying in February of 2021. But it wasn't willing to let me know any of the facts about it because that'd be a violation of her privacy and not appropriate. Now this is super interesting, right? Because it takes the sort of the generalized sense of the liquefaction of reality and really does start to push it. And it gets mysterious. I noticed a couple of times of actually being a little bit, how would you say, maybe shocked and demoralized. So I was using it to do research and analysis, economic information. I was pulling up lots of economic information and having it do analysis and creating charts, saving me a lot of time until I discovered it was completely making everything up. All the numbers were completely, and it would change them from iteration to iteration, which as I learned, as I thought about it, of course it does. It doesn't have the concept of number. It doesn't have the notion that the GDP of Bangladesh was a number. It just has a statistical arrangement of letters. I mean, it's whoo. And it has a temperature metric that it uses to produce believable text. But what that temperature metric necessitates is that every time it says the same number, it's going to be a different number. I think that's actually a very nice way of modeling what it does. It produces quite believable charts until you scratch, and then you realize it's complete nonsense.
Exactly. And even if you ask it concepts like, say, what does a relational identity system look like? It is able to understand the idea of relationality and identity, but it doesn't understand what that would mean at all.
At
And
all.
the kind of at all, like, and so this is where I found the experience massively underwhelming. Actually, from a kind of complex cognitive level, you look at it and you think, actually, if you scratch the surface, it becomes garbage very quickly. Actually, much like the numbers, right?
Yeah.
And yes, it can make an app. Actually, an app that nobody would ever use, but it can make an app, right? Like there's a sort of like, and I wonder whether obviously there's philosophical questions about it, about the generative nature of it, but there's something about it that I found massively underwhelming, actually. And I suppose that's one of the things that the more I've scratched it,
Yeah.
because actually the power is in the nuance. The power is in the specificity. It's not in the probability. It's in actually the specific word in that specific context in relation to that specific conversation. And that's what creates language isn't a probabilistic story. It's a specific story.
Yeah, so let's run that piece right there. So I'm going to run the optimistic and the pessimistic.
Yeah.
I think that actually hits on maybe a key element of this moment in time. Like this is a postmodernism crisis. Actually, originally I thought that maybe of grammatology was the best text. And then I decided it was maybe actually logic of sense was the best text to really get a handle on what's going on here. But it kind of cuts in two different directions, and it's almost like which direction do we choose to go? In one direction, I can see many people more and more nuanced and sophisticated versions of this technology optimizing for pure rhetoric, meaning becoming extremely good at persuasion. There's no reason why I wouldn't be good at that. I should be very capable of being able to select the arrangement of expression, perfectly sociopathic, the arrangement of expressions that causes some kind of preferred behavior from a marketing perspective. And what's interesting is that again, it makes it very difficult for us to ignore how super saturated that is in our environment. Right? So much of our discourse is, in fact, not symbolically grounded. So much of it is actually pure rhetoric. So it, just like bullshit jobs, we have sort of bullshit discourse, and this just puts a heavier weight on that fabric. But of course, the other direction is exactly the point of that, which is it creates an awareness and almost a certain sense of discernment for the absence that you're noticing. You start to be able to tell, just because somebody is speaking with significant authority and putting words together appropriately, it doesn't mean they actually are saying anything.
And I think that's where, in a sense, there's bullshit jobs and there's just bullshit words.
Mm-hmm.
And our world is saturated of those bullshit words written with no comprehension or structure or meaning or relevance in many formats. And this wipes it. It turns it into commodities. And I wonder, let's imagine Medium articles being written on the fly every few moments, right? This is what it does. It allows anyone to be able to write a kind of set of prompt engineered, but it just saturates the media to the point where it actually becomes meaningless. And the construction of meaning becomes a real art. And the construction of context and text becomes genuinely profound thought again. So I don't know. I suppose I sit slightly underwhelmed and slightly amazed by the kind of reaction of people signing letters. As well, just to bring it back to, and maybe it's a kind of a European context, right? So this is I'm just sat there going, yeah, it seems slightly, I get it, but at the same time, surely it's discernible.
Well, it's one of the things that I definitely have been paying a lot of attention to is how much attention is being paid.
Yeah.
And when I kind of visualize it like this, what I'm looking at is what is the size of the possibility space?
Yeah.
How rapidly are we going to explore that possibility space? I'm super interested actually in seeing what happens when you glue together, which is happening. So we'll see it. Things like a search engine and something like Wolfram Alpha and something like a non-LLM database, so that the LLM is acting as effectively an operating system interfacing with other kinds of systems and begins to graft a different sort of set of, I guess you might even call them kind of neurological capacities. 1 second.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's a massive opportunity space. I also sort of, one of the things, I suppose, let's just riff on this, is, so one of the things that's been striking me is we are using machine learning to give us answers, right? So we've it's an answer response. So we ask a prompt, it responds to us.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some work going on in machine learning environments around asking humans better questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which means that machines don't become, we are not what I would say, the actionable agents, but we're in dialogue. So they ask us questions. So imagine a machine more as a psychotherapist,
Mm-hmm.
as a developmental psychotherapist working with humans, where it becomes a reflective landscape for inviting us to search for better answers. Now that flips the human-machine synthesis, into a completely different landscape and allows the machine to operate as a wide spectrum cognitive system, which machines are very good at doing, as in vast sort of contextual data arrangements, but actually working through a developmental model of humans. Now that, for me, feels very interesting and exciting, which
And
flips the relation.
And very doable.
Absolutely, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can.
And
I mean, the ability for a system like that to be able to do diagnostics by a variety of questions and answers and then use a derived model of development to be able to locate where it is, and then to begin the process of engaging in what would be effectively dialectical pedagogy, I think is both very doable and very attractive.
Absolutely. And in a sense, what I like about it, it puts machine-human relationships not into an action control landscape. So I ask it a question, it gives me an answer, I act on the answer, but it puts humans and machines into an ennoblement landscape, a landscape of didactic, as you rightly said, developmental models.
Now,
And
interestingly, Zach Stein, when I chatted with him about this, he made the argument, which I like, from a user interface perspective, having the user interface of the machine not at all resemble a human, meaning the kind of the intuitive, even the unconscious sensibility should be that your body, not even your mind, your body knows you're not interacting with another human. You're interacting with something which is distinctly not human, not necessarily bad, but definitely not human. Which I think is quite, I think he's right, actually. The argument for that I think is pretty good.
so in terms of design, if you look at Apple, like Apple went through a series of anthropomorphic designs to create trust, a little smiley face on the Apple thing, to then slowly evolving as the computational and the resolution environment became higher and higher resolution to more synthetic independent design. So the kind of icons have become more and more abstracted. And so I wonder whether this is a resolution question of anthropomorphism being a kind of a means to solve a resolution problem, to create enough trust. And then as the resolution, informational resolution gets stronger, it can become an identity or a thing by itself, has its own way of being in the world, as opposed to trying to be quasi-human as a sort of morphic relationship model. And I wonder whether, and the other thing I was thinking more and more, especially with ChatGPT and flipping it to a question modality, I think this is where voice becomes a very interesting interface. Right?
Yeah, I'm
Voice.
noticing even wanting to.
Exactly. More and more, I don't know about you, but like more and more, I'm using voice as an interface in, say, Slack, which does automatically transcribe your words into writing. And actually, so the ability to use voice interfaces becomes, and the quality of translation is very high now. So suddenly, voice interfaces start to become a very powerful device, especially when you're starting to have developmental questions, which aren't answer orientated, but are actually reflection orientated. So they have a completely different modality of orchestration around it. So I think the whole nature of interface and then the identity of that interface becomes really key.
Do
Hello.
you remember Indy? It's been a little while since he and I have
It's
chatted.
been a while. Oh,
So what this makes me
very.
think about, and it's been something I've been weird, almost like expecting for a while, is the return to orality. The movement from orality 1.0, the pre-literate orality, through the entire arc of literacy, and then a restoration back to a new orality, which has as its primary differentiating character translocality, which we're doing right now. We're having a conversation as if we were face to face, using a lot of the same modalities of that, with the big distinction being that we're not in the same physical place.
Yeah.
And I've been very intrigued by that from kind of a Marshall McLuhan sense of what are the implications of that. And I think there are actually many of these implications are positive.
And also, yeah, I mean, I'd agree. And I think they're also a key part of our, going back to previous calls about this planetary relationships. Translocality is a key part of actually recognizing our embodied relationship at a planetary scale, um, um, both at a material level, but also at a relational level around the world. I think so. Those are going to be, I think, key parts of the story. And also, what I find fascinating is that how does contextuality appear in this landscape? So contextuality is not just place, it's relational. So it's actually more relational. It's a function of relationship. So our contextuality is a particular reality as a function of our relationship. And there's also a physical contextuality, it's an entanglement of the relationships around you. So if you see it as a sort of contextuality as an emergent function of the relationships and their entanglement, that you start to see that those relationships become a key part, and the entanglement becomes a key part of the function of contextuality, and thereby must be a key part of any sort of assisted machine computational frameworks.
Yeah, there's so much. It's funny. It's one of these things where I can feel what you're describing, and I noticed there's a bunch of things that I can say want to or potentiating their emergence, but it's actually this extremely rich. The first move that I was said, okay, in my mind, I was flipping it and going the other direction of saying, okay, let's take a look at the arc of decontextualization, which has been very much almost the arc of maybe even literacy, but certainly for a significant period of time. The psychological, how do you say it right? It's a very non-trivial issue to really contemplate the implications of recontextualization, or in fact, a regrounding of context. I wonder, have we already had this conversation, or is this something that
we haven't. We've had some time ago, we had this conversation. Let's use the river as an example. There's the river as an entanglement of flows, and it's a verb. It's a rivering. Then there is the river as an abstract, an abstraction of the river, which is the river, and it's a concept which is a holder, which we can put sort of a map to. We can give its boundaries. We can give it a name, and then there is a river as a god, as an agent, and is not a static thing, but a dynamic thing that is evolving and that is living in cycles, and it has a power and a majesty of itself in a sense, and it has agency in it's embodied agency in itself, that cuts rocks over time, that does extraordinary things, right? And these three things, I think we've enhanced the object river, we've undervalued the embodied river, and we've underconsidered the river god, i.e. the agency of river in many formats, and the agency of it. And I think what I find interesting is that our current computational landscapes are allowing us to understand river as flows again. I think our Cartesian logics could allow us to understand river as object. And I think our machine learning capacities and our predictive models are allowing us to construct river as gods again. So I think it's the intersection of these ways of being that I think is both object, flow, and agent, is constructing a new idea of thinginess in the world. And I think it's a function of these new tools of bureaucracy, new comprehensions of organizing, that are opening up this reality. And for me, this hybridity is really interesting, because I think it's both agentifying the world, it's both objectifying the world, and it's both entangling the world simultaneously. And I think we often try to flip from one to the other, say we're moving from A to B, but actually what's happening is all three are now starting to become live. And this hybridity is really, and that's been a bit of a breakthrough for me, is that I was often thinking of how do you move from noun to verb, and more a noun to verb to kind of sort of a super noun, like a capitalized noun, godlike, and more like I'm thinking that it's the hybridities of these things that is the real thing that we're moving into, and the coexistence of these hybridities.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the point. If you're making a shift from the decontextualized to the contextualized, it's always going to be the hybridity that's the most fundamental tone. And it's the multiplicity, right? It's a characteristic of multiplicity that you when you move from 1 to 3, you're moving into a fundamental relationship of singularity to multiplicity, and that's what lands. And it's nice because you get there. It's funny if you can think about it from the psychology. You get there by going from 1 to 2, which you still perceive as being 1 plus 1. But then when you finally go to 3, and they're modally distinct, right? There you cannot do anything but to flip to a quality-based relationship, which then causes you to then shift into a multiplicity relationship, which is to say a fully contextualized relationship. Yeah, I think that is the how would you call that? I don't even want to call it psychological. It actually feels the right term would be spiritual, something like that, like a different way of understanding the nature of that word. But that's the kind of shift that is essential. And interestingly, I actually had a conversation with somebody recently, maybe about 2 weeks, who was proposing something that I had first heard from you. He was proposing it, I think, maybe even more categorically, which was to ground that all LLMs, and he means all LLMs, the notion of a generalized LLM that is kind of about everything and can be everywhere or about anything is the big mistake. I think is his primary argument. And instead, they should be grounded in this creation of capital N nouns. So when I encounter an orange, there should be a way for me to relate with that orange with an embodiment, with an AI that is the sort of the avatar of the essence of orange. And by the way, is context aware, so it could be able to represent just that orange, or orange as category, or orange tree as category. And then if you map this to everything, what's interesting is that the one thing that is left out is human, which is humans. Right? So if I'm interacting with you, I interact with you, and that awakens in us the relationship of us in relationship to our capital N now. And that's our job, right? That's very interesting what the psychological shift of that kind of a construct would be.
Yeah. I think that starts to, and I think it's at that level I think that is the level that I think the transition we're in the middle of. And that's also the level of the kind of the restructuring of our relationship in the world that we need to do in order to be able to challenge, I think, the self-terminating system. The self-termination quality is a functional result of the breakdown of our relationship at that level. So when we can only see the river as the object, actually, and the externalities of that are non-measurable, non-comprehensible, that they become so significant that they're self-terminating us. And just to sort of, put some, sort of keep the scale of it is what I found extraordinary. So I recently looked at some stats.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's a shirt, this average shirt that I'm wearing, probably about 40 pounds or something. And if you were to price this shirt in true environmental and social costs, it's between 200 to 400 pounds, 450 pounds, which means that actually pretty much everything we're buying has a 9x externalization, right? A 9x externalization intuitively feels right when you think about it, but it's extraordinary what that means for actually the scale of correction we're in the middle of.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Daniel actually, I think, made the very nice point that the way we got there is that the nature of the game for a significant period of time was precisely obfuscating and smuggling externalities into everything that you do, because that's the competitive landscape, right? If I can get away with having it look like it only costs 40 and my neighbors has it look like it's costing 400, well, I guess I just took market share. And it's a heck of a lot easier, as it turns out, to fake it than to hide the externalities in this vast, global, high complexity, high distraction landscape than it is vaguely to just make it a better shirt.
And in effect, at the moment we've reached is the moment where those externalities are no longer hideable. Because
yes,
because the reality is that, and there's two-form problem. One, we've saturated our infrastructures, so microplastics in our water, air pollution, in our context, our food systems becoming actually incredibly polluted, our indoor air quality being 5 times worse than outdoor air quality. Actually, what we've simultaneously saturated the system, and secondly, the feedbacks of those saturations are now self-terminating us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually, and so this is such a fundamental regearing of our relationship with everything around us, because it's the end of that ability to see things through the object narratives and the externalization being invisible, because the relationality was non-codifiable. Now that relationality, as a result of the internet, as a result of new bureaucratic theory, is transforming that. And so we're in that pivot moment of that reality, which I think is extraordinary.
Yeah, so what I was noticing, well, I guess two distinct things. One is this piece right here is of the same tone as the previous point about bullshit jobs and bullshit, which is, I guess we might call it bullshit economy. But the point is that in every single case, it precisely has to do with the ability to counterfeit, to counterfeit, to produce a signal that isn't the thing that it is supposed to be signaling, but in fact, it's a super salient artificial. Each one of these cases is the same category. And it has a triadic failure condition, which is where we're at. Right? One failure condition is that it's saturated the ability to externalize. We're up to our eyeballs in bullshit, and now you can't deny it. And then on the flip side, we now have reached a point where the underlying capacity is, on the one hand, accelerating that to the asymptote, to the limit, and has the ability to actually penetrate the complexity to bring us back into a way of actually understanding our relationship with the reality we're interacting with. You can actually do a full accounting. You can actually do a rectification of names so that words mean things, right? You can actually orient people towards vocations that are fully nutrifying the body, mind, and soul, and is in fact the actual best way for them to bring value for the larger community that they're part of, right? All of these things are now doable. We can do them, and the space that we're leaving is simultaneously completely unstable, and we're able to finally be aware of that with precision.
And exactly, and that requires a sort of recoding of our relationship in the world, because as long as we keep an object-subject relationship with the world, we actually permit a landscape of violence which is self-terminating. So actually, this is why this is a sort of a not just a shift of technologies; it's fundamentally a shift in our being, in our relationship of being.
Yeah, and I
relation.
wanted to hit on that because I don't know if you saw it, but Daniel actually has, I think, a very nice video that came out a couple days ago, a conversation with Liv Bourrie about they were using the concepts of Moloch and the concepts of AGI back and forth, using them to kind of bring highlights out of both. And the proposition I would make, this is very powerful actually, because many people struggle with how do you deal with the Moloch problem. And I would say that the Moloch problem is actually not, at the end of the day, a problem. It only emerges when one has slipped into this decontextualized location. We've found ourselves in a decontextualized psychology in the context of a decontextualized economy. But by simply restoring the more fundamental and more natural, this is the key thing, it's a restoration of a more basic, more fundamental, more natural location of a fully contextualized spirit, Moloch simply evaporates. It cannot be present. And when you are in this relationship of multiplicity, when you are in the relationship of noun, verb, and capital N noun, or noun, verb, and the divine, I'm trying to say it right. It's like there's what's the right metaphor here? It's like we're out of joint, but it takes effort to keep us out of joint. And so when that effort is finally no longer able to continue to keep us out of joint, our more natural state is this relationship of multiplicity. A more natural state is this, spirituality. And in that more natural state, the Moloch problem actually just evaporates. It's not even there anymore.
That's not even a problem.
Found.
Yeah, I think that's very, very smart. And in that process, I think words like property vaporize. So words which are dominion words of control, dominion words of possession, dominion words of violence in their own frameworks because they optimize the world to us. So it opens up, it sort of dematerializes certain structural forms that have been the means of us capitalizing our relationship with the world, the means of structuring the world that we see around us. And then it opens up key words, I think, like words like freedom. So what is freedom in this context? So what is freedom in free association? Right? What is freedom in, because I think we have to recognize that we've not been living in freedom, we've been living in servitude. And actually our economy, our constructs of control, our constructs of dominion, there's a classic line, you own it and it owns you in the process. It's a symbiotic ownership. And the kind of, actually to break that, to be in care with, to be in relationship with, to be in treaty with, becomes a new thesis from which freedom emerges, because actually you remove the violence, the asymmetric violence in the situation. So I think the reappropriation of a new thesis of freedom becomes really critical in that discourse. And it also means how we relate, the interface between ourselves and our computational world. Even let's go back to ChatGPT. Our relationship is it instructive? Is it instructional? Is it answer orientated? Is it development oriented? These are choices of how we construct and relate to the world. And I wonder whether we're still operating in a Q&A world as opposed to a dialogic and discovery orientated world. And what does that do? What's the nuance of the way we construct this and this relationship? And I think these are sort of soft grammars. And like I liked your point about grammars, like the grammars of our relationships or our interface with things, which need to be softly turned to operationalize in this world.
So I just began a conversation. I think I'm joining a group called the Center for the Restoration of Sovereignty. And interestingly enough, on the menu, our next conversation is precisely going to be about this question of property. And it brings to mind to me, how would I say? That's the right way of putting it. Maybe a little bit of a disappointment that I've had as I've become more clear on an imported conceptual limitation of the American Revolution, because it did not, in fact, stem from a place of what I would call sovereignty, capital S, but rather stem from a case of establishing a slightly higher degree of liberty from the sovereignty of the king. And it was a revolutionary consciousness. But revolutionary consciousness doesn't recognize the reality of real sovereignty. What it tries to do is it tries to get a little bit more freedom in the context of servitude.
Exactly.
And that's like, and therefore, as you said, it imports the dominator, right? It imports it. It can't help it. It's created a larger, it's like a slave being given 50% more latitude. Still a slave.
Exactly. And I think our theories, and this is, using the tools of the master, which is theories of property, we've all become slaves in the process, up and down the chain. So employment contracts are actually just an extension of servitude systems. Let's be really honest. And they cut their rules and their policy frameworks are derivatives of slavery. They're not actually a new economy of work in itself. They are derivatives of that. They're your silence, your lack of democracy to speak, your lack of freedom of free speech and work. These are all silencing systems. When you look at them, they're incredibly tyrannical. If you look at them in the broader spectrum of actually some of the rights that we've established in society, they're incredible things. And they're incredible things. So the question really becomes, how do we recognize this systemic violence? And I think we've probably reached the end I think we talked about this, the end of one American dream. And it does require a constitutional reform at the level of actually rewriting the Constitution, at the scale of becoming our forefathers, um, and actually having the courage to write a new American dream for the 21st century, a new American Constitution for the 21st century that actually transcends not just humans but non-humans, recognizes agency in a radical way, recognizes our planetary interdependence. Maybe there is an extraordinary moment on the table, and the rebirth of America can't be done without a rebirth of its constitution at a radical sense. Because I think you're right, we're still trapped in reaction, like reactory control mechanism. It was still trapped in an old world. It was a reaction to kingship, so we were still trapped in the theory of control. And now there's a great emancipation on the table, and an emancipation which is the only way to free us from the tyrannies of our own dominion, both up and down chain.
I think you're onto something. And I'm saying that from the point of view of prediction as well as prescription. Meaning I'm noticing that let's call it the tenor of where we're headed. Let me say it slightly differently. About 12 or 13 years ago, I undertook a deep study of the concept of crisis and the concept of catastrophe, which are very closely related if you think about them deeply. Things like when do rubber bands break? When do dams burst? When do bubbles pop? A variety of different kinds. And one of the consequences of this investigation is that it gave me a vocabulary and a set of concepts to begin evaluating. Where are we? Well, I would say that we're pretty close. We're accelerating down the pipeline of crisis at the level of what you call it, American Dream N, wherever we are. We're probably not 1.0, but we're sort of in the 1.7 family. And I agree with you actually completely that the shift, the magnitude and quality of the transformation, I would actually maybe use the word resurrection, given how close we are to Easter, just to kind of hit the tone just right, is of that sort. But there's a rebirth in the sense of to die and then to be reborn. No question, actually. It's weird. Like I can feel it. The truth of that is very strong. It's both necessary and available in this moment. And I can perceive it, although I cannot quite language how this answers the questions that so many people from different directions are dealing with. If you're trying to solve problems now in the moment, using the tools of the master, regardless of how difficult, how much effort you've put into trying to change them or refine them, you're not going to get where you want to get. This is why it causes so much. This is what causes so much acrimony. To create like when divide and conquer is a fundamental strategy. When you've reified the throne to the point there's nothing but its essence available, all that's left is divide and conquer. Not even for any purpose other than its essence. Right? The throne is all that's left. There's no one sitting on the throne, but the throne's still there. And we are continuing to perpetuate it because we're still living the logic of how it perpetuates itself in our behavior, our psychology, and most importantly, in our soul. So we have to completely die and then be reborn in a landscape where that throne is not present at all. And then we're on the other side.
And exactly. And unless we can break the stranglehold of the throne fundamentally, we cannot become a planetary civilization. We cannot actually deal with the weaponization of externalities. We cannot avoid, I would say, mutually assured pathways of destruction. And that's why, for me, this requires this level of shift. And without this level of shift, which is both a consciousness, awareness, a relational, and an institutional shift. And where I have where I have hope is that, to use a bad phrase, life finds a way. And the second thing is, I think the choices we have are really only two: mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving. And everything else is a non-viable theory. And I think that's it. That when, and I think I know many military and defense people are running scenarios to get us to 1 billion, 3 billion, whatever the magic number of the carrying capacity of the world is that they believe, rates from 700 million to 4 billion, depending on how you do the calcs. But I don't believe there is a pathway when you unleash that violence for us to be able to actually pull any form of handbrake to pull it back, because of the, as Daniel rightly talks about, the distribution of the capacities of mass destruction. You've mentioned this, Jordan. The tools and the devices that we've constructed and their scale of violence that's unleashable, and the trauma that will unleash as a result of that. There is no pathway.
No.
And I think that in itself might be the most magical thing, because there is no pathway. And if sooner we realize that, then in game theory terms, either we want to commit suicide or we want to live. It's really quite simple. Everything else is a non-willable scenario. And I think
let me hammer that a little bit, because I think I mean, whether or not any of the individuals you mentioned actually watch this, their computers will. Let me flag it for attention. I myself have spent meaningful time endeavoring to disagree with the argument you just made. And I looked at the carrying capacity. I'm relatively misanthropic and introverted as a basic person, so I was quite disembodied at a cognitive level. So I was capable of contemplating, at least in principle, the possibility of, okay, well, let's just get population down to 1 billion. Everything will be peachy keen. So I put myself to thinking about that. And there's, by the way, one of the things that came up was to produce a virus that had a particularly high virality rate, a relatively low mortality rate, but has one consequence: a reduction of reproduction rate. I did not think about the notion of using a treatment modality that had an equivalent reduction or a bigger reproduction rate as a piece of it. Very clever. All right. If that were something somebody did, very clever. But I thought about it hard, and I thought about it rigorously. I took it seriously. And I came to the conclusion, which I can articulate in some detail, that it can't be done, as you say. So I'd like to propose, if anybody who is contemplating such a thing, and as you said, there are in fact many, were to come across this video, I'd be happy to have a conversation, because it seems important to be simply clear on the fact that that's a non-starter. It is a null set. There are no pathways where we get this thing down to a sustainable 1 billion person population. At least not for 10, 15 generations. It may very well be that in a place of consciousness, perhaps as an extraplanetary species, we do in fact find our way into a very different relationship with the Earth. But for the period of time that's relevant, say for the next 3 or 4 to 6 generations, no, there is no path. And all the paths that will go in that direction with consciousness and intentionality are very bad. You don't want to go there. And then, as you say, the good news is this: there is an alternative. That mutually assured thriving is in fact perfectly plausible. Perfectly plausible.
And I think this is where it gets interesting, because I think most game theorists tend to believe that you can get to some handbrake solution. And I don't think there is a handbrake, like you said, and you've run the numbers, and I direct everyone to get in touch with Jordan if this is fully web legible, because I think it's really important we understand this. I think this is an illusion to pull the handbrake. And if there isn't, then the other side of it is, how amazing is it that this planet has given birth to 8 billion complex, hyper complex cognitive systems, which are now wired together, wired informationally together. We've created a vast planetary neural network that is functionally more than a neural network. It's an agent network, which is able to do complex agency. So now let's imagine this at not as a loss level, but as a kind of extraordinary function that this planet has been able to produce a hyper-complex social agent neural network at a planetary scale that is able to orchestrate and geoform the planet at a rapid scale, far more than evolution or anything else could do. Now, that's not distinct from nature. That is the function of the planet. Let's not imagine it as anthropomorphic, as something distinct. Let us fundamentally imagine this is the evolutionary capacity of the planet itself. Now, that might be the most extraordinary leap that any planet has done, possibly. Right? So this might be the thing that is emerging, as opposed to the loss that we chart to how we get to 400 million or 800 million or 1 billion. Right. This might be the thing in birth. And at that moment in time, mutually assured thriving becomes almost the kind of like we are in a chrysalis moment where we've used stored energy in the planet, which has been stored for 60 odd million years, to unleash enough energy in the systems to give birth to a complex neural network at the planetary scale, to actually allow it to be able to make a computational turn in terms of its energy systems and feed systems. This is an extraordinary chrysalis moment at a planetary scale. So I think it's also how we see this stuff and how we frame this fundamentally changes the dialogue. And I think we need to see this dialogue through a different lens fundamentally. Because if we do, we start to see it's an extraordinary asset that's being built. An extraordinary being that's giving birth to.
Yeah, very much like the way that you were putting it in terms of the energy, right? There was a stored energy, like a pregnant woman putting on weight to be able to actually support the infant, right? It was stored energy put in there, and we've taken advantage of it. We could put it that way, right? We've taken advantage of it. Yeah, it just you take that from the point of view of folks who are concerned about climate change, right? The Extinction Rebellion narrative. No, it's birth. It's not extinction. It's birth.
It can be. This is the thing.
Can be, right.
It can be. It can be birth. And this is why I'm not I try not to be, I try not to go backwards and say, oh, we got this wrong. Maybe this is the emergent pathway. Maybe we had to use stored energy to get to this moment to be able to transfer. And I, in full recognition of what Nate's already been saying, Nate Higgins and other people, that the quantum problem is still massive. But actually, this is like a 500 billion human unit worth of energy transition. So yes, but this was the moment to get to having the capabilities to make that transition, and to be able to do it at a scale of a planetary social neural network of an order of magnitude and capacity that's never existed before. That's opening up these opportunities. So this is in no way to discount the externalities, no way to discount the risks that we're facing, but to see those risks in the context of something new being born, not necessarily just those risks being.
Did you? I was present to all three of my daughters being born. Were you there as well?
I was. Yeah, I was.
So that's just no joke, right? If you actually are really physically present to the labor of a single human woman giving birth to a single child, and the magnitude of that, like that is a serious piece of work. And say, okay, now we're doing the same thing, but now at the order of magnitude at the planetary scale. Right? We can't discount. We're not discounting anything. This is going to be a serious piece of work, but it's possible. Right? It's in fact, I would even say beyond possible. It's probable if we just are able to make a few key shifts.
Exactly. Life finds a way. And I go back to that. It's a boring Jurassic Park language, but I think we mustn't discount the thesis. This is where I sit with hope. I think the choice that we face is mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving. And the mutually assured thriving is far more extraordinary than people are making out. It's not the mere continuation of our life as it is, but it's actually the emergence of something much more extraordinary.
Yeah, it's funny. I was
And that's why language like sustainability is not sufficient. I do not want to sustain this. This is not something to be sustained, the lives that we live. I think we're in the birth of something, a chrysalis of a whole new thesis of what it means for the planet. I think a whole new thesis of the planet is being given birth to. And
Yeah.
that is what we're part of, not a thesis of maintaining human in our kind of moderately poor consumption orientated human lives, which is, like we talked about lives last time, quite problematic in terms of actually the dopamine economies that we exist in. I think, but these were devices to get us to a moment.
Yeah, the language of sustainability, if you're familiar with the language of zombification, whether they zombify economies or zombify companies, I really think the language of sustainability is the same as the language of zombification, right? The only way you can create anything as sustainable is you got to just almost fully kill it, but not quite. It's undead, right? It's neither alive nor dead, but it's in a terrible place in between. And this is not actually a real category. It's a false category. There's one more piece you were saying. I wanted to shoot. What was it? Oh, darn, I lost it.
I mean, whilst you're having a thought on that, I think the sustainability point I agree with. I think there's nothing we can sustain here. Like, I think we're in a moment of vast transition. And the scale of this transition, I think, is completely, let's build on that, conversation we were having about the shirt, the 9x problem of externalization. So if the common day shirt is $450, right, the everyday shirt is $450. This is a completely different material economy,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're going to buy 2 shirts, and those shirts are going to last you 10 years. You might pay $40 a year for those 2 or 4 shirts.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a completely different material economy. Our relationship with materiality isn't that of consumption or dopamine hits, right? It's a completely different idea of relationship to our materiality, and the tactility of it, the relationality of it, the sensuality of it becomes much more critical components, because you're looking for a 10-year value chain rather than a 1-moment dopamine hit. So I think we have this structures, this reshifting of our material economy, reshifting of our consumption economy changes everything, and it changes all forms of, and I think, then it really opens up. As we dematerialize our economies, we also open up a whole landscape of augmented economies and other things that open up. And there's a real question whether the dopamine economy is now shifting from our material world into our immaterial world. And the question is, how do we deal with it? And how do we understand those incentive systems and the kind of control that and the mal effects that they generate? But I think it's that order of transformation. I think the kind of, just to put language to some of this stuff, like I think the stats are 68% of S&P 100s, if they had to price in social and environmental goods, are non-viable. 68%. So
Yeah.
it's a 70% order destruction. So this is like an extinction level event of our economy, right? It's more, yeah.
Okay. So try this one on for size. Let's work.
Yeah.
I'll say it this way. I believe I was responding to a recent video with Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin talking about ChatGPT, LLMs. They actually coined a nice term, golems, GLLM, generalized LLM. And I watched the whole thing, and it was, quite well done. They're both quite talented and quite earnest. And my commentary there was that at some point around minute 45, I noticed a felt sense in myself, and then I watched them, of fear. They're beginning to speak and act from fear. And my commentary was very simple. It is my sense that no longer can we operate from the basis of fear. Full stop. So when you're contemplating the notion of an extinction event of the Fortune 1000, you may have a feeling of fear. My proposition is no longer can we operate from the basis of fear? You must become capable of operating from the basis of love in the face of what is coming. If you can do that, and if we can do that, then we can navigate this thing no problem. And I think it may in fact be as simple as that.
Exactly, and I think it has to also be. I think that love is a great frame, and also it's an invitation to be your bigger self.
Mm-hmm. It's,
And I
it's
think
actually
this is
very specifically, right? It's actually a drawing into what does it even mean to be in a relationship such that, right? You are in relationship with your biggest self and expressing that more and more into the world. Like that's becomes the human responsibility.
exactly, and I think this is and that's why, for me, the describing the scale is not meant to be a theory of terror, but a theory of invitation,
Mm-hmm.
an invitation to a generation to become the 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 generation that wrote the Constitution, and to not to become the generation that is willing to rewrite the Constitution, become the generation that actually takes ownership of the fact we're going to have to operate in a landscape of being outside our comfort zones of history, because there is no I think there is no backward looking answer to the future that we face. There is no backward looking answer
Ah, so
to the
nice.
future we face. And
Yeah.
and that is an invitation to discover, to be something that we've never understood ourselves to be in the past. And that I think is really important. And that I think is genuinely the invitation. And to operate, as you say, without fear into that landscape is, I think, really critical. And to fear and love, the default of love into that landscape will be very critical in that format.
Mm-hmm. That's a very strong challenge. That's not a trivial thing at all. Um, but we know actually that people have been able to accomplish that in history, have been able to stand in that way in the face of quite terrible experiences. So it's doable. Again, not easy, but doable.
And metaphorically, I suppose it is like the analogies are that we are going to have to, to explore tomorrow as people explored space, as in physical space, and the
Hmm.
planet in one way. And we have to re-embrace our theory of being able to operate into the unknown, not operate into the charted landscapes of a predictive tomorrow.
Ooh,
And,
that's good. Yeah,
and I think
spatial temporal transposition. That stepping into the mystery of space was a thing that we were very familiar with for a long time. Now that the boundaries have closed, we've become demoralized that all space has been explored, but we don't. But now the mystery is actually the mystery of the future, the mystery of time.
absolutely, and there's a genuine, and this is what I suppose I'm is is the scaffolding of that is, yes, there are scaffolds of this in past, like we've spoken about Hawaii and indigenous cultures, and there are rhymes in the past. They're not replications, they're rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
And those rhymes marry with new capacities. And they, at the crossover of the entanglement and the kind of enlightenment, our new capacities are emerging, which are giving forth new ways of being, which are extraordinary invitations. And we are going to have to let go and to be able to explore into that temporal landscape with a new sensibility at the heart of it, and a new invitation, and an invitation which has no pathway other than to explore. There is no choice.
Mm-hmm.
This is the thing. The mutually assured destruction pathway actually, for the first time, removes the choice. There is no choice left. And that is a liberation for us. Actually, the loss of choice
Ah,
actually constructs the pathway of commitment to having to find a way. And that is powerful.
all right. Let me link that back to the proposition earlier that it's also more fundamental and more natural. That there is a restoration It's so interesting. Like the link is resurrection and restoration, having a very similar sensibility. And the visual image that I was just having was, you're walking around with a map for a very long time. Millennials are very used to this now because of the omnipresence of Google Maps. But you forget, as a human, you're a natural explorer. And we're actually really good at that. Naturally, very good at it. You can go into an unexplored territory and find your way and take care of yourself. That's a thing we can do. And so when you begin to realize that you've reached the edge of the map, and you can no longer rely on the map to get you from point A to point B, you may feel a hinge of fear, but it's actually an invitation to grow back into.
And so this opens up the kind of interesting conversation. Let's go right back to the beginning. When we're at the edge of the map, what can advanced map learning technologies give us? It's like,
yeah,
right. So, and I think this is really one of those moments where historical knowledge, historical informational landscapes, historical backward-facing additive frameworks, do they give us the pathway? Can they scaffold the pathway to a planetary civilization when actually in history there's never been a planetary civilization?
right. It's new.
It's new, genuinely new. And can they perceive a future which isn't constructed on the relational probabilities of the past and linguistics that are actually historical? So
Wow.
what is the ontological new in this conversation? And I think this is what I'm really struggling with, that most of these technologies are backward-facing technologies, rear-view mirror, sophisticated, high resolution in some ways, given the other context that we had this conversation with, backward-facing technologies, and fundamentally entrenched in the past. So an 8 billion social neural network of agents at a planetary scale that are able to do vast scale reorchestration of material energy resources. That's never existed before. How do we deal, and that's why I think at a cognitive computational comprehension level, this is genuinely new. It is not an extrapolation of a past. There is no extrapolative future. So
something I've noticed, how's this word? It hasn't actually at the end of the day been that long. For me, 15 years or so. And for a long time, relatively speaking, for the first 5 years of that, there weren't that many people that I could have a conversation with. And a few people began to show up. Interestingly, many of whom have become somewhat notable, somewhat famous, which is an interesting point. But more and more, and it's accelerating. I'm beginning to have conversations with the people who just live nearby in my neighborhood that are of this sort. That's a very hopeful reality, I would say, that it's almost this emerging, that sense of a holographic emergence. It's emerging sort of everywhere, and people in a wide variety of all walks of life are becoming more and more conscious of this sort of thing. And the vocabularies are different, and the particular both capacity and focus is different. But of course, it's the same story because, as you said, there's only two.
Yeah, and one of them is discountable.
Yeah,
and
you
even
scratch it off, not that way.
Yeah, it is not a choice, really. And when you embrace that, and I agree with you, I think there is an emergent quality to this cognition. This cognition is an emergent function. it's an emergent function of the discrepancies becoming so visible and undeniable that actually they are forcing us to look in different ways, forcing us to see these things, these discrepancies, whether it's the shirt, or whether it's a spoon that you buy for 50 cents and you think, how do we mine fucking iron ore, smelt it, all right, and with vast amounts of energy and make a spoon for 50 cents? Like, how the fuck does that all happen? Like the actual, the discrepancies are so visible, the matrix is almost fraying to tell us. Like, it's like saying, look, it's not real, it doesn't work. It's like
that's right. When you look at the spoon, it's funny, there is no spoon. This is the there is no fucking way spoon.
Right, and you can pick anything. You can pick anything like that. And so I think this is where, when the discrepancies become so systemic, and like I said, they're 9x, they're not like 1.2. They're not like 1.2, it's a marginal error.
Yeah.
It's a magnitude error that is so visible that it's viscerally comprehensible, which means that actually, as soon as you have a distributed planetary intelligence, this thing just becomes self-awakening because it's non-deniable.
Right. All right.
And that's where I share your hope.
I just got the note from the 4-year-old that it's time for me to go. She has some surprise.
Good.
Well, I just wanted to share one thing that was keep bouncing in the back of my head, because we've come back to the $40 shirt a couple of times. And I read a Twitter thread in the past month, and it was asking the question of why did people dress so much more impressively back in the day? And the answer was because they didn't have many different outfits to wear, and they didn't have cars to get into and out of. So they actually had to have one pair of clothes that they might have for 6 months, maybe more. And it had to be able to endure a 10-mile walk to get to where they were going. So it had to have pockets for carrying things around, multiple different layers for different temperatures. It had to be made out of very high quality material that could last for a long time. And as it turns out, when you build something with those design requirements, they also tend to look good.
And I think that's a sensibility we can feel as well. And that's why I think you're right, that this intelligence is no longer a function of smart people. Perhaps it never was, but it's just that the distributed discrepancies are visible, and every human can now see those frames of those realities and those 9x factorials in the system. And so actually, this is an auto-computational problem right now. It's self-emerging because of the discrepancies. So I'm going to let you go and have a lovely time with your daughter. All right, my friend. You take care.
Bye-bye.